Not a lot of people want to talk about it because when you talk about it, you put a target on your back. And I think one of the first things I want to ask you is, how does someone stand up and do the right thing when they know that they're going to face great opposition when they do it?
A shocking letter has surfaced, and it's sending shockwaves through Daystar. Rebecca and JW have revealed details that many thought would never come to light, exposing secrets about Joni Lamb that are leaving viewers stunned. The letter challenges everything people believed about leadership, loyalty, and the hidden side of the network. As the content spread, questions mount. What exactly was kept from the public? And how far will the fallout reach? The controversy is just beginning. The moment the letter from Rebecca Lamb and her husband, Jonathan Weiss, came to light, it sent shockwaves through the Daystar narrative. For years, Joni Lamb had presented a clean, confident story to the public. Only Jonathan and Susie had raised concerns about Pete, and any allegations could be dismissed as misunderstandings, bitterness, or personal grievances. It was a neat, controlled narrative that reassured viewers and protected the ministry's reputation, but the letter changed everything. This wasn't speculation or gossip. It was a detailed account from someone inside the family who had witnessed troubling behavior firsthand. JW's words described moments when Pete's interactions with Jonathan and Susie's young daughter crossed boundaries that no responsible adult could ignore. Physical contact and displays of affection that seemed innocent on the surface, but in context, were deeply concerning. What made the letter so powerful wasn't just the details, it was who wrote it. JW wasn't an outsider or a distant relative. He was part of the inner circle, married to Joni's daughter, someone who had been in the same rooms, at the same events, and seen the same family dynamics. His testimony confirmed that the concerns weren't limited to just two voices. There were multiple witnesses inside the family who recognized that Pete's behavior was troubling. This completely undermined the two lone accusers' story that had been used to dismiss the allegations. Suddenly, the narrative Joni had relied on to protect Pete in the ministry no longer held up. The letter also highlighted the contradiction between what was said publicly and what was known privately. Joni had repeatedly told viewers there was no evidence against Pete, framing any questioning as unwarranted doubt or drama. Meanwhile, inside the family, there was clear documentation of troubling behavior. JW's letter wasn't vague. It contained specifics that painted a picture very different from the one broadcast to millions. It became undeniable proof that concerns extended beyond Jonathan and Susie, and that the family's private reality had been hidden for the sake of a carefully managed public image. This contradiction, the gap between the polished public statements and the documented private observations, was the first crack in the facade. It showed that the united front Joni projected to the audience was, in reality, fragile and incomplete. For the public, the letter revealed that what had seemed like a simple, controlled story was actually a story of conflict, concern, and complicity quietly buried behind the scenes. In a single document, JW and Rebecca had exposed the truth. The narrative everyone trusted was only part of the story, and the real picture was far more complicated than anyone had been allowed to see. For the public, the image of the Lamb family during the allegations against Pete was one of unity and strength. Joni Lamb had long presented a united front, a family standing together in faith, trust, and loyalty. Interviews, broadcasts, and public statements all reinforced this picture. Only Jonathan and Susie Lamb had raised concerns, and their complaints were treated as isolated personal disputes. On camera, everything looked controlled, neat, and reassuring. Supporters of Daystar believed what they were being told. They believed the family was united, that the accusations were just a small ripple in an otherwise steady pond. But behind closed doors, reality was far more complicated. The public front was polished, but the private family dynamics told a very different story. Inside the Lamb household, there were voices that challenged this narrative from the start. Rebecca Lamb and her husband Jonathan Weiss were among them. They were not passive observers of what was happening. They had seen troubling behavior firsthand. According to multiple accounts, Rebecca and JW were deeply unsettled by Pete's interactions with Jonathan and Susie's young daughter. It wasn't vague concern, it was a level of discomfort that compelled them to act, at least privately. They reassured Jonathan and Susie that they would stand by them if the situation escalated, even if legal action became necessary. This was not casual sympathy. It was a firm, unwavering promise of support from inside the family. a clear signal that the accusations were credible and taken seriously by more than just the two initial accusers. Despite this early support, over time, Rebecca and JW receded from public involvement. The reasons for their silence remain unclear, but the effect was significant. The family that once had multiple witnesses willing to speak out now appeared as though only Jonathan and Susie were raising concerns. Their silence allowed the official narrative to persist unchallenged. In the public eye, the story remained simple: two lone dissenters, a temporary pause in investigation, and a family united in faith and loyalty. That appearance of unanimity was crucial to Daystar's messaging. It reassured supporters, preserved the ministry's image, and gave Joni Lamb a powerful position from which to manage perception. This retreat into silence was not neutral. It actively reinforced the illusion of a united front. By stepping back, Rebecca and JW effectively removed themselves as counterweights to Joni's public statements. Their absence allowed the narrative to suggest that any opposition to Pete was limited, isolated, or even irrational. The public was left with a story that was carefully controlled, one that did not reflect the complexity and concern that existed behind the scenes. Silence, in this context, became a tool of influence. It wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about shaping perception, maintaining credibility, and controlling the narrative in a high-stakes environment. The consequences of this silence were far-reaching. Jonathan and Susie, the two who continued to speak out, faced intense backlash. They were portrayed as troublemakers, as individuals challenging the family and ministry without justification. They lost positions, income, and support within the ministry. Meanwhile, those who stayed silent, like Rebecca and JW, maintained their roles, influence, and relationships. On the surface, silence appeared to be the safer, smarter option, but it carried a moral and emotional cost that was invisible to outsiders. The decision to remain quiet meant allowing troubling behavior to go unchallenged, letting a narrative persist that misrepresented reality, and effectively prioritizing the family's and ministry's public image over the truth. Over time, the impact of this silence extended beyond the immediate family. Supporters who believed in the united front were misled. They were told that the allegations were minor, isolated, or unsubstantiated. They were not informed that multiple family members had initially witnessed behavior serious enough to warrant concern. By maintaining the appearance of unity, Daystar and the family shielded Pete and the ministry from scrutiny, while creating an environment where those willing to speak faced isolation and retaliation. Silence became a weapon as much as it was a shield. It protected the institution, but it suppressed accountability and distorted public understanding. The United Front myth also had psychological effects on the family itself. Those who had initially spoken up and then receded may have felt conflicted, guilty, or trapped. They were balancing loyalty to the family, concern for the ministry, and the public narrative they had helped craft or defend. The pressure to conform, to stay silent, and to preserve appearances likely contributed to an internal struggle, a quiet tension between what they knew to be true and what they allowed to be portrayed externally. That tension demonstrates how influence works, not only by shaping public perception, but by shaping the behavior and choices of those within the institution. The myth of a united family had a broader impact as well. Supporters of Daystar, who believed the public narrative, were less likely to question leadership decisions, less likely to scrutinize statements, and more inclined to accept reassurances at face value. The appearance of unanimity fostered trust, and trust allowed control. It created a situation where those in power could dictate what was known and believed, while dissenting voices were marginalized. When multiple family members were willing to speak but chose not to, the story of a united front became self-reinforcing. The silence of insiders validated the narrative to outsiders, creating a loop where perception and reality diverged even further. Ultimately, the myth of the united front and the deliberate silence of key family members revealed the dangerous power of influence in shaping narrative. What outsiders saw as cohesion and faithfulness was, in reality, a carefully maintained illusion. The private reality, a family with multiple witnesses of troubling behavior, internal concern, and conflicting perspectives, was hidden behind a polished public image. That gap between what was said and what was known is where trust begins to erode, and where the true story slowly begins to emerge. In the Daystar case, the united front was never real. It was a performance, maintained through silence, influence, and careful control of public perception, and the consequences of that illusion are still being felt today. When the police temporarily paused their investigation into the allegations against Pete, the public perception was completely different from the reality behind the scenes. Daystar, and specifically Joni Lamb, quickly seized the moment to craft a narrative that would reinforce the image of Pete's innocence and protect the ministry's reputation. On television, in interviews, and through public statements, the pause was framed as if it were proof that the accusations had no merit. Viewers were told to trust that Pete had been fully cooperative, that he had answered every question, and that the lack of immediate action was a sign of divine vindication. The pause was painted as a victory, a moment that confirmed what supporters already wanted to believe. The allegations were baseless, and the family and ministry were united in standing against false claims. But the truth was far more complicated. Law enforcement paused the investigation, not because Pete was innocent or the claims were unfounded, but because the child at the center of the case was emotionally fragile. Authorities recognized that forcing testimony at that point could have caused serious trauma. The investigation was effectively on hold, not concluded. This nuance was critical, but it was never shared with the public. By omitting the reason for the pause, Daystar presented a version of events that conveniently reinforced its narrative while concealing the real reason for the delay. Supporters had no way of knowing that the pause was procedural, not exonerative. The subtle but powerful spin transformed a temporary procedural measure into a public declaration of innocence. The framing of the pause had ripple effects across public perception. For many viewers, the lack of action on the investigation appeared to confirm what Joni had been saying all along. Only Jonathan and Susie had raised concerns, and their claims were exaggerated. Daystar's messaging implied that if there were real evidence, law enforcement would have acted immediately. By controlling the language and omitting key details, the network made it seem as though the lack of prosecution equaled proof of innocence. This was strategic. The pause became a shield, a tool used to protect Pete, the ministry, and the family's public image. At the same time, the framing undermined those who had spoken out. Jonathan and Susie Lamb, the original accusers, were publicly painted as troublemakers. Their voices, already controversial for going against the family narrative, were further discredited because the investigation's pause could be spun as confirmation that there was no wrongdoing. Any concerns raised by insiders like JW and Rebecca Lamb were silenced or ignored, and the public was left with a neat, reassuring story. This created a false sense of closure, while the reality behind the scenes remained unresolved. The deliberate framing also demonstrated the power of influence in controlling narrative. Daystar leveraged its reach, authority, and credibility to shape how millions perceived the situation. By presenting the pause as vindication, the network guided public opinion without needing to address the underlying facts. It was a calculated move that relied on trust and authority. Supporters assumed that if the ministry said Pete was cleared, then he must be, because they had no access to the procedural details and no reason to doubt the family they trusted. This approach highlights a broader issue about public messaging and institutional control. When an influential organization manages information, even procedural actions like a paused investigation can be reinterpreted as definitive proof. For viewers, it reinforced loyalty, minimized doubt, and protected the brand. But it also obscured reality, creating a gap between what people believed and what was actually happening. This gap allowed Daystar to maintain its narrative for an extended period, shaping perception while avoiding accountability. However, the pause and its strategic framing couldn't fully contain the truth forever. As the contents of JW's letter and the observations from Rebecca Lamb began circulating privately, cracks in the official story emerged. People started questioning why the investigation had been described as a sign of innocence when procedural realities told a different story. The more details surfaced, the more it became apparent that the narrative presented publicly was carefully curated, selectively framed, and designed to protect the ministry rather than fully inform viewers. The framing of the investigation pause illustrates how influence, authority, and selective communication can shape public perception. A temporary procedural measure was transformed into a public declaration of innocence, misleading millions while suppressing dissenting voices within the family. It demonstrates the way narratives can be manipulated when information is controlled, and how easily public opinion can be swayed when key details are omitted. In the case of Daystar, this strategic framing was a turning point. It maintained the illusion of unity, discredited the original accusers, and shielded the ministry from scrutiny. even as the truth simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Ultimately, the pause was more than just a procedural delay. It became a tool of narrative control, a lesson in how influence and selective communication can bend perception, and a stark reminder that what the public sees is not always what is true. By presenting a temporary pause as proof of innocence, Daystar turned silence, omission, and timing into powerful instruments of influence, shaping the story in ways that would take years to fully unravel. The story of Daystar, the Lamb family, and the allegations against Pete didn't end with a paused investigation or a carefully crafted public statement. The consequences of influence, silence, and moral compromise stretched far beyond what anyone could see on the screen. What unfolded was a web of decisions, pressures, and calculated omissions that left long-lasting marks on the family, the ministry, and the public's trust. At the center of this was influence, the quiet, almost invisible force that shapes behavior without the need for threats or overt commands. Daystar was more than a family ministry. It was a media empire with deep connections to pastors, donors, and influential figures in religious and political circles. Within that ecosystem, the cost of speaking out was enormous. Employees, family members, and insiders understood that one wrong move could mean losing positions, financial security, and social standing. The same influence that built loyalty and faith also served as a subtle form of control, guiding people's choices through fear, expectation, and the knowledge of what was at stake. Jonathan and Susie Lamb felt this weight immediately. They refused to stay silent when they saw behavior they believed was harmful to their daughter. They were accused of exaggerating, lying, and betraying the ministry, and the consequences were immediate. They lost their roles within Daystar, their income, and their social connections. Their willingness to speak created isolation, leaving them to navigate backlash largely on their own. Meanwhile, Rebecca Lamb and her husband Jonathan Weiss, who had initially observed and documented concerning behavior, chose silence. The reasons for their quietude remain uncertain, but the effect was clear. The official narrative could continue unchallenged. The selective silence of insiders created a system where speaking the truth was risky, and staying silent preserved position and influence. The moral cost of that silence, however, was not invisible. Choosing to withhold critical information, even if motivated by fear or loyalty, came with consequences that could not be ignored. JW's letter, detailing first-hand observations of behavior that crossed boundaries, never made it to the police or became part of the official record. Without it, the ministry could continue to claim innocence, discredit the original accusers, and protect its public image. But in the background, those who stayed silent carried a burden: the knowledge that truth had been hidden, that a child's voice had been muted, and that the public had been misled. Over time, that awareness became its own kind of weight, a quiet pressure that can linger for years, shaping decisions and eroding personal integrity. The influence of Daystar and the Lamb family didn't just protect individuals, it shaped the story itself. By controlling the narrative, the ministry dictated how viewers interpreted events. Supporters who believed Joni Lamb's statements had no reason to question the narrative, and those who might have doubted were easily dismissed as troublemakers or biased outsiders. The public's understanding was curated, limited by the reach of the ministry and the credibility it commanded. Influence, in this context, functioned as a tool of perception management. It wasn't about lies in the conventional sense. It was about framing, omission, and strategic communication. By carefully choosing what to reveal and what to hide, Daystar maintained an illusion of unity, competence, and righteousness, while concealing the complexity of the situation behind closed doors. Silence and influence together created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. The fewer voices spoke out, the stronger the public narrative became. The more the official story was accepted, the greater the pressure on potential dissenters to remain quiet. Those who considered challenging the narrative saw the consequences suffered by Jonathan and Susie, and understood that speaking up meant risking everything. At the same time, silence allowed the ministry to continue functioning without disruption, preserving relationships, donor confidence, and institutional stability. But this preservation came at a cost, not just to truth, but to moral accountability. Choosing the easier path, remaining quiet to protect image or position, meant compromising principles and, in some cases, allowing harm to go unchecked. The long-term consequences extended beyond the immediate family. Viewers, supporters, and the wider community were affected by the selective narrative that emerged. People who trusted the ministry had been told that the allegations were isolated, baseless, or motivated by personal grudges. They were not informed about the full scope of witnesses, the content of JW's letter, or the reasons the investigation had been paused. This selective communication shaped public perception, creating a false sense of clarity and certainty. When the truth began to leak, even in fragments, it shattered that perception, leaving supporters feeling betrayed and disillusioned. Trust, once lost in a faith-based organization, is difficult to rebuild, and the gap between public statements and private reality became a permanent scar on the ministry's credibility. The moral implications were even heavier when considering the child at the center of the allegations. Decisions driven by influence and fear prioritized institutional reputation over safety and accountability. By choosing silence over disclosure, the ministry and family members who withheld information allowed a vulnerable voice to remain unheard. The ethical cost of that choice cannot be overstated. Protecting a brand or an image became more important than addressing potential harm, and the weight of that decision is something insiders must carry indefinitely. Even years later, the effects of this combination of influence and silence are visible. Those who spoke out endured social, financial, and emotional consequences. Those who remained quiet may have preserved their positions, but they also carry the burden of knowledge, the understanding that they could have acted differently, that a child could have been protected, and that truth was manipulated for appearances. Public perception, meanwhile, was shaped for months by the carefully constructed narrative, leaving questions about credibility, transparency, and ethical responsibility that linger to this day. In the end, the Daystar story is a cautionary tale about how influence and silence intersect, creating a cycle that protects institutions while silencing truth. Influence discourages action, silence preserves appearances, and the moral cost grows quietly over time. The public sees only the polished image, while those on the inside live with the weight of what they know and what they allowed to remain hidden. When the truth finally emerges, as it inevitably does, the consequences ripple through families, communities, and institutions alike, leaving a lasting impact on everyone involved.